This and this, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
When the IBM PC came out, I looked at it really hard and I thought, I really should develop products for this guy. But it was just such an ugly beast.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. David Young was the creator of Omnimon, the popular hardware monitor debugger for the Atari 8-bit computers. His other products included DiskScan, a floppy disk utility, Supermon, which was the predecessor to Omnimon, Omnicom, a terminal program, and Omniview, an 80-column handler. This interview took place on June 11, 2018. In it, we discuss Wes Newell, whom I previously interviewed.
I feel really fortunate to have grown up when I did, and pre-computer days, or at least pre-home computer days, because when I was in high school, I was actually the last. My senior class was the last class at our high school where the physics students used slide rules to do all their calculations, and after that, everybody used calculators, and so it's really a watershed moment as far as I'm concerned. And that summer, after graduating from high school, I bought my first programmable calculator, an HP 35, which had 50 programming steps, and basically that's how I learned to program. I mean, I just had a lot of fun with that calculator and created little games, very crude games that were all based upon numbers and things like that. So that's how I kind of got interested in programming. Now, in college, I didn't study programming. I was an electrical engineer, but I did have a couple of programming courses, and which I didn't do very well in. And I didn't like them, but they were required, so I had to do them. And when I got out of college, my first little job, I thought that I would be developing circuits and that sort of thing for a little avionics company up in Dallas. And as soon as he found out that I'd had a couple of programming courses, he said, "Well, we're going to stick you to programming. That's all there is to it." And I said, "Well, okay, I'll give it a try." And I just haven't looked back since. It's gotten into my blood, and even though I'm retired now, I still feel like a programmer. It's kind of in my bones. I'm passing it on to my son. We have a lot of fun with the latest programming technologies like Scratch and Bitsbox and things like that, where I can introduce to him the concepts. And yeah, we have a lot of fun with it.
Nice. All right, so you're working at this avionics company and you're programming, and then what happened?
So back then it was all in assembly language. Business had COBOL and there was Fortran and stuff, but when you're talking microprocessors, you were lucky to have an assembler. And we were using Intel processors at the time, 8035, 8048, little 8-bit guys. And I really cut my teeth on those things, and I was fortunate to work with closely with a guy who was actually getting his PhD at University of Texas at Dallas at the time. We just worked side by side, and I was just in awe at the things that he could do and his theoretical knowledge that I didn't have any idea about, but he could really do some sophisticated programs, and I learned by just studying his code and working with him and stuff like that. So that helped a lot. But around 1980 or 81, I forget, somewhere around in there, I started looking at the home computers that were, becoming available. And Apple II had been around for a while, but the Atari had come out, and so I picked up an Atari and started working in the evenings, playing around with that. And of course, everything at that point was in assembly language, so it was an easy transition for me between work and and home just to play around with it.
What kind of things were you doing with it?
Well, the first thing I did, my first real product was a disk utility. I don't remember what it was called, but I sold it, on a floppy disk.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember taking it to the first Atari local club meeting there.
Where is local? Where were you based?
This is Richardson, actually, which is part of Dallas. It's a suburb of Dallas.
Okay.
And that's probably where I met Wes Newell, at one of these meetings. But I had made I don't know, a dozen copies of my disk utility, and they sold out in 5 minutes.
Wow. Was this DiskScan?
DiskScan. There you go. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that in 30 years, but yeah. DiskScan, yes. So I was just demonstrating how it could read in sectors, and you could modify the sectors or write them back out. You could read them in sequentially, or you could read them in using the file system. You could read a whole file in, and you could disassemble. Well, I'm not sure if I had disassemble at that point, but at any rate, it was primitive but useful for people who like to go in and change up the games or whatever it is that they were trying to do, and that's what kind of gave me some ideas that maybe there is a market. If you develop useful products, maybe they can be sold and maybe make a little money at it.
Nice. All right, so you created DiskScan and it's selling, and you're going to these meetings, and then what happened?
So, gosh, those meetings were great because that's where you met the people who were as passionate about this as you are. And everybody has different talents and different skills and ideas. And, I met several people, including Wes, I'll talk about in a minute, but I met a guy named Bill Ransom who was a hardware guy, and he worked at Raytheon, designing missiles and stuff. So he really knew his hardware, and he had designed this little piggyback board to install in the Atari 400, and as it turns out 800, to utilize that area of the operating system that was vacant in the stock Atari. And but it was all hardware, and he said, hey, I've got this little board where somebody could write a neat program and we could put it up in the operating system. He had a couple of ideas, maybe a hardware monitor of some sort. And I started thinking about it and thinking, well, yeah, I can do that sort of thing. I do that sort of thing at work, all the time. And maybe we can come up with something. And we did. That was the beginning of Omnimon. So it started out as a piggyback board that, and Bill was very clever. He designed the board so that it could be bent. It had a little header on it that could be bent over so that it could fit in both the 800 and the 400. That was part of the challenge. The 400s, there was a huge market for 400s out there. The 800s had just come out, and so we wanted to be able to take advantage of both markets. And we both invested quite a bit of money. I forget exactly, but we're talking $10,000 or something to do the first run of boards, and so he was working on the hardware and getting it produced, and I was working on the software, on the monitor, on the Omnimon part, and we came out, and I think we built 1,000 boards. Yeah, I think it was 1,000 boards the first time.
Wow. The first product, I believe, was called Supermon.
That's right, exactly. Mm-hmm. It was called, very good, Supermon. And for some reason, I decided to change the name of it. I don't remember that. both of them are kind of corny. Um, uh, and, and at any rate, after just a few months, we had sold out of that first run, or at least it looks like we were going to sell out. We had to anticipate the demand, and especially because Christmas time was when you sold like more than half of your products. I mean, that run from November to December was like, if you didn't have products to sell at that point, you lost half your business. And so we were anticipating, looks like, this Christmas, coming up Christmas, if we put in the ads, and I was in charge of the ads. I don't think that Bill did any advertising, but we kind of anticipated the Christmas season and geared up. At some point, we did a second run, I think, of maybe 2,000 boards this time, and that run actually lasted. I don't think we did three productions. I think it was just a second production run that lasted me several years. For one thing, the piggyback board became less and less of the business, and I started selling Wes Newell the ROM, just the Omnimon ROM, and he actually plugged it into his operating system board, his ramrod, and that became more and more of the sales for me and for him. So that was a real symbiotic relationship that I had with Wes.
So who was buying this thing? Was it legitimate programmers? Was it pirates? Was it somebody else? Was it all of the above?
Well, nowadays you would consider them all legitimate programmers. I mean, even what we would call hackers today there's a huge demand. I mean, it's a skill set that's sought after for both legitimate and so-called illegitimate reasons, but it all requires a huge amount of skill and the right tools. And I think that's all I was doing, was providing a tool that I needed for my work, because there really wasn't anything like it out there for developing programs, debugging programs. There just wasn't anything like it, and I've always been that way throughout my career. If I needed a tool, I would just develop it and start using it, because it was just necessary for the work that I was doing, and so that's how I used it. I know a lot of people use it for programming. A lot of people use it for hacking, but it's all good as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. All right. So if I'm understanding correctly, it sounds like Bill did the initial design of the hardware. You designed the actual monitor software that would run in it, right. And then later your software was migrated to Wes's products. That's right.
Okay. And the key to making it all work was intercepting the interrupt vector that was, one of the interrupt vectors that was in the Atari machine, and we used a 2-button combination to activate the monitor. And so in Bill's piggyback board, it was actually a hardware interrupt, and in Wes's ramrod, it was part of his operating system mod.
Cool. So you were doing this the whole time alongside. This was a side hustle, and you had a real job the whole time.
Yes, at the beginning, for the first year and a half or so, I had a real job at Rockwell Collins, which is a defense contractor. But I was making money at selling these things, and finally decided I just got to give it a go and do this full time. And at that point, I quit my job, and I was unemployed except for the Atari stuff for 2 years. And during that time, it's when I did the bulk of my development and really tried to ramp up my business. Of course, I had no no business training or anything, so I didn't really know what I was doing at that point. It was just a sort of a fun thing to do from a technology point of view. And what really demonstrates that is when the IBM PC came out, I looked at it really hard, and I had access to one, and I thought, I really should develop products for this guy. But it was just such an ugly beast that and at that point I was kind of getting tired too. I mean, I worked really hard, just round the clock, no vacation, just kind of burned out on the whole thing, answering phone calls all the time. One man operation. Although at the time my wife helped me package stuff and ship, but it was pretty difficult period. And after 2 years, I finally decided, okay, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. There's just too much pressure, and I went back to my former employer, Rockwell Collins, and said I'd like to have another job, please, and they gave it to me. And then I ended up working for them for 28 years after that. So, and gradually over the next 2 or 3 years, my Atari stuff I let it wind down because I didn't have as much time to develop products, and I'd missed the boat on the IBM PC, and I realized it was a huge mistake. And I watched the Norton utilities take off and thought, I could have done that.
Mm-hmm. So in another universe, there could be Omnimon could have moved to the IBM PC side and still be a product today.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, just look at Norton. What's his first name?
Peter
Norton, right? I mean, I'm sure he's many billions of dollars richer for it all. Yeah, that could have been me, but I don't have any regrets. I mean, I had a great career. I loved my job, and the Atari was a lot of fun. And in the end, it was it was successful in a small way. It's not like I lost a lot of money or anything. I did okay, and then I just moved on. But that's a long time ago.
Yeah. So was it profitable?
Oh yeah.
Good.
Oh yeah. It was just amazing how easy it was to make money. I mean, if you had some skills back then and you could create almost anything that was halfway good, you could sell it. People were just hungry for stuff. And Wes, I'm sure, told you the same thing. I mean, of course, that was like 2 years ago. Everybody ought to go back and listen to Wes Newell's interview.
It was a good one. So tell me, I have a list of products here. I just want to list them out. If you have any stories or memories or anything about them, you can chime in. Otherwise, we'll move on, okay? We started with Supermon, which led to Omnimon. There was also Omniview, which was an 80-column handler. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So back then, doing word processing on that Atari was so painful. Using 40 columns on a TV set where it was just blurry, and you couldn't see what it was going to look like when it was going to print out, and so it was just really awkward all around. And I think I started talking to Wes, and somehow we came up with the idea, well, there's actually enough pixels on the screen. If you use the higher resolution monitor, you couldn't do it on TV, but if you used an amber monitor or I guess a green phosphor monitor, it had enough pixels. I believe they were probably 4 times 8, so there were probably 320 pixels across. Or no, I guess there had to be I think that was.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And so if you were really clever, you could create a font that was only 3 pixels wide and then leaving 1 pixel for the space between the characters. And so I started working on that font, and it was pretty ugly, but it worked. I mean, you could sort of get used to it. And so I created the actual Omniview which had all of the operating system hooks and everything necessary to actually use it as part of the operating system. And that's what Wes and I started selling, not only for his ramrod, but also for my piggyback board. You could use the same thing on that piggyback board. So I created the 80-column font and all of the hooks to create the Omniview, and then I really needed a word processor to utilize it. So at the time, was it called WordPerfect, I believe? It's a program, WordPerfect, that worked for the Atari, but it was just 40 columns. And this is where the Omnimon comes in, because I was able to use Omnimon to go in and reverse engineer the WordPerfect application in order to figure out how to hook in the 80-column hooks, which is quite a feat, I'll have to admit, because reverse engineering a word processor and figuring out how to convert it to 80 columns was very challenging, and it took me quite a while to figure it all out. But once I figured it out, I came up with a patch for the disk. So it required the people to buy the program, but following my directions, they could actually use either DiskScan, my first product, or they can use Omnimon, both of which could read in sectors. You could modify the sectors, and you could write them back out in the same location. And if you did the patch very carefully, it's kind of tricky. You couldn't make any mistakes. If you did the patch correctly, all of a sudden WordPerfect would come up in 80 columns. And so that was working great. A lot of people had problems with the patch, and they would send me their copy of WordPerfect, and I would modify it and send it back to them, stuff like that. And then there was a was it an Antic that they came out with that nice little word processor. It was that you typed in yourself.
Right. I think you're thinking of a Compute magazine, and it was called SpeedScript.
Yeah, SpeedScript, exactly. And so I started looking at that and realizing, hey, this is actually a pretty nice little word processor. I mean, it wasn't crude by any means. It had a lot of nice features and worked well. So I thought, well, let me convert that over to 80 columns. And I created my own version of that, and basically gave away the patch and also just copies of the thing. At the time, I didn't see any problem because people were typing in the programs, and if they wanted them, I would actually give it to them. But then I got a letter, I think from Compute magazine, saying I couldn't use their program, and I think I changed. But at that point, I completely reverse engineered it. Well, I didn't have, the source code was published, and I had re-engineered the thing from pretty much the ground up, and added a lot more features and made it work, just a lot better. For instance, it would page. You could work on a file much bigger than the original, so you could have a document that was much larger than the original, and things like that. So I think I called that OmniWriter at that point. So yeah, that was another neat project that turned out well.
There was also Omnicom, which I believe was a terminal program.
Oh yeah, Omnicom. Back then, that's how you did the internet thing.
Right.
You would log in via a terminal to a mainframe computer, and from there you could do, things that you used to do on mainframes. There were what they called, they weren't blogs back then, they were called bulletin boards.
Right.
So you could, communicate via bulletin boards. I guess there was crude forms of email back then, and and stuff, but it required a smart terminal program really to do it right, especially as things later on. Initially, they were all just text-based, but then later on, had more graphics sort of stuff, and the terminals got fancier and fancier, and so the terminal emulations, I had to have a bunch of different modes for different types of terminals, whether it was Tektronix or HP, or I forget all the different models and makes, and that's when I came out with Omnicom, because that was sort of an extension of the whole 80 column thing. I was able to take advantage of the 80 column feature of the operating system, and so that's how that came about.
Nice. And I also found there was a version of DOS, sort of looks like you took Atari DOS 2 and modified it somehow, and it says like modified by David Young. I'm not clear what changes you made to it.
Yes. Wes mentioned the guy Charles. I'm blanking on his last name, but he worked closely with Charles, and I got to know him as well. And he had done a bunch of mods to the Atari DOS, and I forget exactly what form it took, but I know that at the time I was. I started to sell memory upgrades. That's what it was. So Wes was buying memory upgrades, and I would buy them from him and resell them. And part of the features that I are kind of add-ons that made my memory upgrade work well was the ability to use it as a RAM disk. Mm-hmm. And so I came up with a mod to Atari DOS to treat that additional RAM as a RAM disk, which just made it lightning fast compared to, loading up a program from your floppy drive. It would load up instantly once you put it up in a RAM disk. So I think that's primarily the mod that I did for the Atari DOS.
Are there other products, software or hardware that I haven't mentioned that we haven't talked about yet that you can think of? You've brought up several that I hadn't even thought about in years. Those are the primary ones. I actually opened my box with my Atari stuff, and I haven't opened it in decades. And I've got an 800, an 800 XL, and a floppy drive, and a monitor. I haven't turned it on to see if it works, but I was primarily just looking to see what sort of artifacts I had left over from those days. I don't have very much. Mm-hmm. I think actually one of the last things I did, I remember Wes Newell came over to my house after I had sort of closed down shop, and he came over to my house and pretty much bought everything that I had from me and took it away. So. Speaking of Wes, when I interviewed him a couple of years ago, he generously put everything that he had done in the public domain, and the manuals and anything that he had done. He said, "Fine, the Atari community can have it." For some of it, frankly, it's unclear whether stuff was his or whether it was yours. So I'm wondering if you would be willing to step up and do the same and.
Oh yeah, anything that he had of mine, it's. I'd be willing to. You can use it for whatever you want. I don't think that he had my source code for like Omnimon or OmniWriter, and I think I have that stuff on some floppy disks someplace. And like I say, I've got a floppy drive. I don't know whether it works. I don't even know if the computer's going to boot up. But if I run across that stuff, and I'm able to salvage it, I will definitely let you have it.
Oh, beautiful.
Don't hold out a lot of hope, but I think I still got that stuff around here someplace. I was looking for it a couple of days ago, but I couldn't find the floppy disk, but they're probably in some cabinet someplace.
Okay. That's very generous of you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
apropos of nothing, a buddy of mine named Rob wrote a program for modern computers, Macs, PCs, Linux, that is an Atari assembler, disassembler, disk viewing thing. It's an amazing hacking tool. And the first version of it, like version 0.1, he called Omnimon in deference to you. And then later, he decided it was confusing, so he named it Omnivore. He rechanged it. So, but it's still it's a little hat.
Why didn't he just take Omnimon as as is and disassemble it and start hacking it? I mean, he could start with something that works.
Sure.
But
well, he built something.
He started from scratch.
Yeah, he did it in Python, which I think is his.
I see. He wanted to do it in a high level. He didn't. He's one of these modern programmers who probably doesn't even know assembly language.
No, I think he's pretty good at assembly language, but
is that right? Okay.
I think he just probably enjoys Python more, and who wouldn't, frankly? So
yeah.
Anyway.
You get comfortable with whatever you know and you work with long enough. You get comfortable with it, and that's kind of what you want to do.
Sure. But yeah, well, he and I have used the Omnivore tool to reverse engineer games, and it's amazing to be able to use a modern computer to hack the old computers because it's just of course so much faster and elegant.
Right.
So
I'll just mention that especially the game companies got very sophisticated later on about making them very difficult to hack. It was a race between the hackers and the game developers and the companies to protect, add more and more protection to the games to prevent them from being hacked. And eventually, I think the game companies won. They became very difficult to they used encryption and all sorts of stuff to protect themselves, so they couldn't be hacked. So.
But your tool was certainly a important weapon in that fight between the companies and the publishers and the pirates.
That's what I hear. I never was a gamer. I didn't hardly play any games. I had a few like Frogger and whatnot, but I never played them. But sometimes there would be a kid over and would come and play my games, but that wasn't something I was all that interested in. Never have been. Sure. I don't. To this day, I don't play games.
So, do you have any stories? This is the part where I just go fishing for your memories of people you met or interesting things that happened in the Atari days that we haven't talked about yet.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Yeah, it was a disappointment that as good and as advanced as the Atari was compared to like the IBM, it just couldn't compete, and that was a real eye opener for me because I was clueless about the power of marketing and all that stuff back then, but I learned that lesson, very well, and ended up using the IBM platform for the rest of my career, and of course, So that's kind of where I feel more. Ironically, that's where I feel more comfortable right now is with the Microsoft products and stuff like that. So I don't know where that fits into your overall story, but it's more of the ramblings of an old programmer, that. And I guess that's the other thing is that I don't know how old you are, Kevin. You don't look that old.
I'm 47.
47. Okay. Well, it was a crazy time to be growing up in the 70s and the computers just starting to take off and microprocessors coming online, and it was a crazy time. I mean, we were just it was very different from it is from what it is nowadays. Um, and unless you were there at the time, you probably can't. I don't think the younger kids can even appreciate what it was like to not have a computer at home. Uh, and to me, there's a huge advantage to having computers at home and at school nowadays, obviously, but it's a mixed bag. There's a lot of disadvantage too because we had to entertain ourselves back then, and we had to use a lot of imagination and creativity and experimentation and discovery just because we were bored. We didn't have anything to do. And nowadays kids don't have that problem. They can spend all day on the computer and never have to, think about it too much. They can just sort of let themselves be entertained.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be careful about that when you're bringing up your kids. I've got an 11-year-old right now, and he's...
Me too.
Yours is 11 as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you know exactly what the issues are.
Mm-hmm.
You want to have the skills, the computer skills to compete, in the future, but at the same time, you got to teach them to be a kid.
Mm-hmm. And it's so easy, I think, on computers with iPads or whatever they're using today to consume media. You can watch YouTube videos, you can play games all day, and there's plenty to do. Like you said, they're never bored, but there's fewer, I think, opportunities to create. It's like they're not going to sit down and write a program in BASIC or whatever. I mean, there's Scratch and stuff, but it's kind of different. Where back then you kind of had to. It's just like, man, you're gonna have to type in this thing from a magazine if you want to play it, and in the process, you're going to learn how it works.
Right. Yeah, the boredom was a big part of growing up, and you just created your own games and your own entertainment, and I sort of attribute that to what allowed me to be successful later on in my career. I was always inventing stuff, creating stuff, thinking outside the box, and I think that's part of growing up in the right environment.
Yeah. What do you do today?
Well, I retired a couple of years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and intentionally, I'll never stop programming, but now it's strictly a hobby. And I've gotten into different things. I play music, I play in an orchestra, play trumpet in an orchestra. And then I have gotten into mineralogy and radioactivity, and so I collect radioactive minerals, and I have a wide network of friends where we share information about our minerals and where to go prospecting, and it's just a lot of fun. And of course, my son keeps me busy as well, so
Sure.
I've got a full life. I was excited to hear that you interviewed Wes, and I went and listened to his interview, and then I've since talked to him.
Oh yeah?
Because you sent me his number. Yeah, we had a nice conversation, lots of laughs.
Was he surprised to hear from you?
Well, I wouldn't say surprised. I don't think Wes is ever surprised at anything. He's so matter of fact about everything. He hasn't changed a bit. So if you run across Bill Ransom, it would be nice to contact him.
I'll see if I can find him. Is it Ransom with an E or just Ransom like ransom?
Yeah, Ransom. I believe it was just like the word ransom.
Okay.
So RANSOM.
And he was in Texas as well, right?
Yes, he was there in Texas as well, in the DFW area. I think he was in Arlington,
Right.
if I remember correctly.
I'll look him up.
So I think it's Ransom, RANSOM, without the E, but it could be with the E. It's been a long time.
Okay. I'll see if I can find him.
Him, and then there was another guy, Chris. What was his name? Chris published probably the very first floppy disk based magazine for the Atari. Well, probably for any home computer. But his first name was Chris, and I'm blanking on his last name, but he actually, for a year or two, published this, you subscribe to it and you'd get a floppy disk in the mail, and it would have articles on it and also games and, just interesting programs. And you could, as a developer, you could submit your program to him and he would give you some token amount of payment. And he actually he got tired of doing it and asked me to take over that task. And I think I did it for 2 months and then got too busy doing my own stuff and said, sorry, Chris, I just can't do this. It took a lot of time, as you can imagine.
I'm not sure who you're talking about, but if you think of the name or of his name or the name of the product, I'll look it up. Sounds interesting.
Yeah, I'm surprised you haven't run across it in all your
well, I talked to a couple of Disc Magazine people, but I don't think I've talked to him. So.
And what were the names of these discs?
The one I'm thinking of is called The New Aladdin. And it was a really slick Disc Magazine thing.
Was it just for the Atari?
Yeah, it was for the Atari and one other system as well. Maybe the Apple as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was one called Micro. They were all the same. Microzine, Microsoft, Micromedia.
Yeah, I think it was Micromedia.
Yeah. Okay. I have one of those around. Hold on a second. I think I literally have one sitting over here. Hold on. Micromedia Magazine, M Cubed publication, Garland, Texas.
I think that's it. Yeah. And it doesn't have a name on it, or
I haven't opened it yet. I'm just showing it to you.
That's it. I remember that M-Cube thing sounds just like Chris. And so if you were to fire it up, you would probably find his name in there.
We'll take a look. Yeah,
he also worked at Rockwell Collins. I think that's how I got to know him.
Well, I've got a stack of them here, so I have some research material I can dig through.
Oh, you got a stack of those?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, probably about 10 or 11 here.
Oh, well, one of them was probably the one that I did, or one or two, I can't remember. One of the later ones. But anyway, yeah, look through them. They'll probably find some interesting names in there.
Sure. So this podcast is listened to by people who still use and love and play with their Atari computers. So if you could send a message to the people who still love their Ataris, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Well, I guess I'm kind of like Wes. I'm like, probably time to move on. But I can also appreciate the nostalgia of doing that sort of thing. And it's if you're my age and still fooling around with your Atari, it's probably a good thing to keep your mind active and whatever makes you whatever you like to enjoy. That's great. It's better than, sitting on the couch and watching some sports program. It's got to be a lot better than that. So it's not a very upbeat message, but that's about all I've got.
All right, fair enough. I think I have what I need, David. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was great talking with you, and I appreciate you reaching out and bringing us all back together.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, there are two ways you can help. You can help fund these interviews directly by contributing to my Patreon. A small monthly contribution will help offset the expenses of making these oral history interviews. Contribute at patreon.com/Savitz. Or make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.